Hello, my name is Bethany, and today I'm going to be talking once again about fairies. I have chosen to do the subject of fairies in the Romantic, Victorian, and Edwardian era because that is when there was kind of like a large boom in the belief of fairies again. And some of the things that I found were really kind of interesting. And it was like the fairies and the belief in fairies kind of echoed what the people of England were feeling. And one of the things that kind of drove this belief and this boom was at the beginning of the first part of the 18th century. It was almost like England was having a loss of identity. And the stories of the Grimm brothers from Germany kind of swept in and reignited the fact that the fairies were a large part of their history, and they didn't want to lose that. So they started documenting and writing down stories that they've heard, that people have said, and were reigniting a part of who they once were, and they didn't want to forget that. One of the books that I had found by Carol Silver, called On the Origin of Fairies, Victorians, Romantics, and Folk Belief, they stated, and I quote, "But the intense activity of the first half of the century was also a response to the growing concern that fairy belief was dying and in danger of being lost." So it wasn't just fishermen and small town people and housekeepers and villagers that were trying to maintain this folk belief. It was actually some of the most educated people, historians and writers and scientists were even getting in on trying to focus in on who these creatures were, what they did, what they looked like. Anthropologists were trying to find some sort of any kind of objects they left behind so they could study how they lived. Wasn't just fairy tale anymore. These people were getting into, let's find them historically, let's understand who and what and if these creatures were real. And it didn't just end with this initial boom that started in the beginning of the century. In fact, it went into the Edwardian era, and we can see such beliefs in the writings of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien with their stories. But with them, it wasn't so much of writing down the history of these beings. In fact, Tolkien wanted to kind of compare fairies to that of kingship in England. And he was using a completely different level, a completely different world, Middle Earth. We all know about Middle Earth. And the reason why he chose this was that he was reflecting the belief of Christianity by using fairies and elves and these different creatures that he wrote about to be a reflection, not an allegory. In fact, he said that he hated anything to do with allegories, which is why he made it so different but yet similar when he was talking about kingship and the ultimate kingship being God. Now, a lot of people, especially when we get into the Enlightenment era, were thinking that those who are researching and trying to figure out if these fairy creatures were real, kind of thought they were being, well, on one hand you had the people who were trying to discover it scientifically, and then on the other hand you had scientists who were thinking that it was ridiculous to find these creatures scientifically. So it was a weird dichotomy when you come to think about what they were doing. And Yeats' Fairies and the New Animism by Sinead Matter, it was one of the things that they talked about was that a man coined the phrase animism in 1871 when he was talking about religion and trying to understand why people would animate things that weren't necessarily meant to be animated, such as finding a soul or finding a god that doesn't exist or whatever. And in this part of in this book, they were using animism, or the new animism, to bring life into fairies. And it's kind of weird because you have half the people trying to document different creatures, which they found a bunch of different creatures, because you can't say a pixie is a brownie, you can't say a brownie is a dwarf, and you can't say a dwarf is an elf. They categorize them, which I think is kind of awesome. Some of the things that they kept doing was they kind of also equated what was happening with the fairies in their culture to what was actually happening in England at that time. Charlotte Bronte mentioned that fairies were leaving England, and one of the reasons why, and I quote, "the nation was growing too industrial and technological, too urban and material for their health and welfare." Now, there they mean the fairies. So they were trying to hold on to the identity of fairies in an industrial world that's losing their natural surroundings to those of factories and larger cities, and destroying, nature to what with the fairies leaving, because this is all becoming too industrial. This was kind of an interesting search to do, because no one could definitely say that they were or weren't fairies. No one can definitively say what happened to the fairies or what didn't happen to the fairies. And then on top of that, they threw in a religious aspect of the fairies, because they were trying to understand where they might have come from. Once again, in my previous one, I mentioned that the fairies were thought to be, at the very beginning of their existence, were a Christian ideal, because they couldn't figure out if they were angels or demons, so they created this whole other level of helpers that God sent that didn't fit with angels or demons, and so they created this very aspect. Now here, they did the same thing, but without the fear of being called witches or being stoned for being pagans. And what they did was they said that fairies ended up being either the souls of those babies who passed away and were not baptized before they passed away, were souls that were yet to be reincarnated, and so they were around on Earth, just hanging out until it was their time to be reborn, I guess. Some of them said that they were not the demons, but angels that fell with Lucifer, that were not picking aside gods or Satans. They were just kind of chilling until things settled down, and they could either go back to heaven, or they decided to join Satan. And so they put a religious aspect on these as well, but with less fear and with less condemnation for thinking of what they were, believing. So there was no fear in believing in fairies. There was no really, it ended up being that you were either smart for researching, or you were dumb for researching, or not dumb, you were silly for thinking these creatures are real. There was a lot of sightings of people, but they can't prove it. But there are a lot of also artifacts which they claim are fairies. Yet there's the same time where, because you can't prove that these artifacts actually came from fairies, how do you know that they came from fairies? So in the end, it kind of ends up being Bigfoot. You have those people who believed, you have those people who don't believe. But it did make life way more colorful. There was artwork, beautiful artwork done by artists and painting fairies, and there was stories, wonderful stories written about fairies, and it just brings in a whole other level of color into society, because of the culture of fairies and how the English, whether they believed in them or not, they did leave us a fascinating trail to follow. I hope you enjoyed this, and thank you very much.